With that, I want to bring up our first speaker. It is such a treasure to have her here. Dr. Carol Adams is one of our country's leading cultural historians, and for years was the president and CEO of the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago. She raised $15 million for that museum, but also raised the visibility of that institution, not only in Chicago, but around the country. We got together last week in Chicago at the announcement of my former boss's, President Obama's library and foundation, and I was so wowed by Dr. Adams that I said she's got to come out and spend some time with us this morning. Please welcome up Dr. Carol Adams.
Good morning. You know how you have your remarks prepared, but then after you hear everybody else, you just keep changing them? Well, this tour has certainly impacted me that way, and so have the remarks of everybody here. So I'm sometimes on the page and sometimes off. So I've been asked to sort of give you a timeline about significant things that happen for African Americans in our struggle in the United States. So generally what that means and what it has meant for most of us when we went to school is that we start with slavery and we go from there. But it's not going to mean that today. Because there are a few things I want to make sure we get if we don't get anything else. And the first one is our history did not begin with slavery. Repeat, our history did not begin with slavery. And starting it with slavery has a lot to do with how we feel about ourselves, both the enslaved and the enslaver. It has everything to do with a set of feelings and emotions that are put into play about who we are and how we ought to approach ourselves in this country. And if we don't do anything else in our positions as preachers and teachers and parents, we need to teach African American children about their glorious past, because it lets them know who and what they can be. And it takes us away from a deficit view of ourselves and our people and moves us to an asset view. Because how can the first people be the worst people? And how does that constantly become reinforced? So we have to go back just to understand ourselves and lift our heads up. I was struck by the person that gave me the tour, who showed Tom Feelings his mural, and how our heads were like this at the beginning and slowly, slowly made their way down. With the shame, because we bore the burden of the shame of slavery more so than the people who enslaved us. If we knew who we were, it would make all the difference. Because part of my task is also to talk about how does that have to do with what things are now, and with what's happening now, and with how our young people feel about themselves, about that sense of hopelessness, about that series of events that went into motion, the results of which we are still impacted by, through white privilege, black disadvantage, through a number of other ways. What if we looked at our history from a real, authentic lens that also now is buttressed by what we know scientifically, okay? To know that no matter who you're reading, you know civilization began in Africa. Whether it was Tanzania or Kenya or Ethiopia, people may argue about that, but they don't argue about that continent. Whether they're talking about original Eve or original Adam, both of those things take you back to that continent. And if you don't know that, you have to educate yourself so you can educate others. So you can, for $14, you can find out all about Eve by getting the DVD that they have produced at National Geographic that takes you back to that woman whose mitochondrial DNA lives in us all. Same thing for finding about Adam and who he was. Because people began to tell us, those of us who were historians who wanted to talk about this glorious past, it's a figment of your imagination. All this couldn't have happened. You couldn't have done all that. Or, hey, some aliens came and built those pyramids. It was easier for people to believe that than to think that we did. And so having a real education is an important thing. We have to pass it on. We're still not doing it. I live in the state of Illinois. Probably it was the 70s when they passed some legislation about how every student, not every black student, every student was supposed to have a curriculum that involved African American history, not as a separate February unit, but interwoven, because if you don't know black history, you don't know world history. It has to be in everything, in every fabric. Not, you can't do it in the short month. It has to be in everything. Guess what? We just got a contract at the DuSable Museum 2 years ago to actually do the curriculum. Guess what? It's not instituted yet. You know, they say, oh, well, it'll take years. You got to train the teachers. You got to do the books. You got to do this. You got to that. Meantime, our children have low self-esteem. Meantime, they are suffering, all of them, from a lack of this information. Now, I'm looking around the room, and you guys, a lot of you look a lot younger than me, so maybe you didn't experience what I experienced going to grammar school just across that river in Kentucky, where we came to Cincinnati so we could feel a little bit of freedom. We took our field trips here because we couldn't go to the movies. We couldn't do certain things. My mother would bring me all the way from Louisville to Cincinnati just to go to the show. Okay, that was an outing. We go out somewhere to eat, and we go to the movies and get back on the train and go back to slavery. But I remember something much more significant than that. I remember being in the classroom, and every now and then, they would talk about Africa, or they would talk about slavery, and I would be so embarrassed by this. I was embarrassed when they talked about Africa, as I imagine some kids might be today, because they showed poverty and deprivation. They even showed people swinging through trees. They showed everything but the glorious age. I didn't know about that, probably till I went to college. I didn't know that Mansa Musa would still be considered the wealthiest man that ever lived, that in the 14th century he had a fortune worth $14 billion. I didn't know about that. I didn't know about architecture and universities. I didn't know we wrote. Everybody told me we didn't. We just talked a lot. It took a while for me to find out. It took a while for me to find out about Timbuktu and the first universities. It took a while for me to find out all those books we wrote. And in the modern era, when they tried to burn them and destroy them, as we see that kind of destruction going on now, to really eradicate the history of many people, war does that. That history is preserved in the homes of people who buried books in their backyard. All the way from the 14th century, the history of Timbuktu lives in these homes because it has been destroyed by the marauders. But it was that important to people to keep it. So the first thing I said I want you to remember is our slavery didn't begin with Africa. You can go on anybody's timeline and see when the first slaves came to Virginia, to Jamestown. You can find out when they were emancipated. You can find anything. Info, please, go there. But the things that are impacting us today, you don't know those dates. You can't find the first date somebody decided it was great policy to tell people who were poor that the only way they could get some assistance is if there was no man in the home. And understand the impact that has on today, on families' ability to stay together, on how women feel about the necessity of a man in the home at all. You won't find that date memorialized, but it's an important date. They told us the date, they said, hey, you can still keep slavery under one condition if it's for incarceration, if it's for something you did. But I don't know if anybody's figured out the monetary value of all that labor. We know the monetary value of the labor that was stolen from us as a result of the chattel slave trade. It's about $100 trillion, okay? Now, would our present be different if we'd been paid some of that money? Well, of course we would have. And the present of the people who still dominate our society would also have been quite different because industry in America was built on that. It wasn't just the actual laboring in the fields. It was the insurance industry, okay? It was the shipping industry. It was the industry of all those crops and all those things. I heard someone, when I took the tour today, talk about how the crampness of the slave ships, people died. If one person got sick, other people got sick and so forth. And so you lost far more than actually arrived on these shores. You might think that only sick people got thrown, only dead people got thrown overboard. But sick people did too. Because they said they were going to die, and if they arrived dead, they didn't get any money for them, but they would get money for them otherwise, and so they were insured. Remember that. Slaves were insured. We just did some, what do you call it, genealogical research on my family here in Kentucky. And we were able to find out some pretty interesting things based on our abilities now with science. So the names, fortunately, we were able to keep. Most of the time, we lost that. We lost name and language, history, authenticity in terms of ourselves. And those things you see today, our kids are not encouraged to know who they are or whose they are or how to put these things together. They're being taught by some form of reality TV where housewives don't even have to be wives. You know, and socializing their attitudes and so forth. I think the bright light means my 9 minutes must be over. So you know I'm about 1 minute in to what I really want to say, okay? So guess what? We did not come as slaves. I hear people always say, well, the slaves came over from Africa. No, they did not. The Africans came. The Africans came and were enslaved. The Africans came and were stripped of their cultural memory and presence and language. The Africans came with their skills, their abilities to grow and do things. And you still are dependent on that country to be the supermarket for the rest of the world. And if we all raised up these telephones and understood that children as young as 5 years old are mining in the Congo to get their cold tan that enables you to talk on the phone, then you need to connect the dots and start thinking about how every little thing we do still revolves around human trafficking and slavery. And we need to get together to figure out a way to get out of it.
Amen. Let's give it up for Dr. Carol Adams. Thank you for reframing our approach to that history, Dr. Adams. You're right. It's a subtle but important thing. We did not come over here as slaves, and that's not the starting point for this history.